The morning heat hung thick over the camp, a wet silence broken only by the buzz of flies. At precisely 9:02 the loudspeaker cracked, metallic, distorted, merciless. "All female prisoners will assemble. Shine the commander's boots with your hair." The words sliced through the damp air like a blade. For a moment nobody moved. Only the wind answered, brushing through the barbed wire fences that glinted like silver veins under the Philippine sun. Rows of Japanese women, Red Cross nurses, clerks and widows, stood barefoot in the dust. Their faces still carried the discipline of the Imperial Army, but inside, their stomachs turned. To touch an enemy officer's boots was unthinkable. To use their own hair, sacred in Japanese culture, was a humiliation no manual had ever prepared them for. One woman, barely 21, whispered, "This can't be real." Her voice trembled more than the air itself. The American guards watched in silence. One of them, Sergeant Hayes, chewed gum slowly, his expression unreadable. Behind him, the camp's wooden watchtower loomed, its flag snapping in the breeze. Reports later estimated that over 3,000 Japanese women were held in Allied custody across the Pacific by late 1945. Most had been non-combatants caught in the chaos of retreat. Yet even among the brutalities of war, this order stood out, so personal, so symbolic. The commander himself arrived 5 minutes later. His boots, streaked with mud and blood, clicked against the gravel. "Proceed," he said quietly. His calm tone made it worse. One woman fainted before the others even moved. The rest stood frozen, breathing shallow, waiting for someone to break. The young nurse, same one who had whispered, felt every eye on her. She thought of her family in Nagoya, of the Emperor's promise that surrender was shame. And then, without knowing why, she stepped forward. Her knees buckled as she bent down. The commander's shadow fell over her like a curtain, closing on her past life. She reached out, fingers trembling, hair loosening from its braid. The sound of her hair brushing leather, soft, rhythmic, was the only sound in the yard. Around her, dozens of women clenched their fists. No one dared breathe. But this act, born in silence, would echo across the camp by nightfall. The sound of her hair against the commander's boots fades, replaced by a memory. Before captivity, before the camp's dust and the watchtower's eyes, there had been another kind of noise, the scream of shells over late, November of 1944. She had been a Red Cross nurse, then assigned to a field hospital 2 miles from the beachhead. The air was heavy with antiseptic and fear. Bandages ran out before dawn, morphine before noon. By nightfall, they were sewing wounds with fishing line. Inside the bunker, every surface smelled of smoke and iodine. The nurse's name was Eiko. She had joined the Imperial Relief Corps at 19, believing mercy could exist even in war. But on that day, when U.S. artillery tore through the coconut trees, mercy drowned in mud. Her unit had tried to evacuate by stretcher truck, but the road collapsed under shell fire. One blast flipped the vehicle, throwing her into the swamp. By the time she crawled out, the horizon was already on fire. Reports estimate that in the Battle of Leyte alone, over 70% of Japanese medical staff perished, many not from wounds but exhaustion. Eiko survived by hiding among the dead for 2 days, drinking rainwater from her sleeve. When Allied troops found her, she could no longer lift her arms. She expected to be executed on the spot. Instead, a young Marine tossed her a canteen. "Drink," he said. That single word shattered everything she'd been taught. In her training, surrender was worse than death. But in that moment, death looked ordinary, something she'd already passed through. The enemy's mercy confused her more than their guns. Later, aboard the transport ship, she wrote in her small notebook, "I am alive. I don't know why. That line would become her quiet rebellion, her proof that survival itself could disobey orders. As the ship's engines roared across the Pacific, Aiko watched the ocean swallow her homeland. Every wave felt like erasure. She did not know where she was being taken, only that her hair, tied neatly under her cap, still smelled faintly of smoke. And years later, that same hair would be the tool of her humiliation. The clang of the breakfast bucket snapped Aiko back to the present. The late fires had faded years ago. Now her world was wood, wire, and waiting. The POW camp woke every day at 5:30 to the same sound, a shrill whistle slicing through the mist. Steam hissed from the cook shed where barley boiled in dented tins. The guards' boots struck the gravel in rhythm, crunch, 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 as if to remind everyone who owned the ground. Aiko's barracks smelled of mildew and disinfectant. Inside, 20 women slept head to foot on bamboo slats. They washed their faces from a tin basin that doubled as a mop bucket. Each morning, they folded their blankets into perfect squares, an echo of the discipline they had once practiced under the rising sun. But this obedience wasn't pride anymore, it was survival through habit. American guards moved along the rows, calling roll in clipped English, Tanaka here, Sato here, Nakamura here. The rhythm was almost mechanical. The camp housed roughly 300 prisoners, mostly women, captured on various Pacific islands during 1944 and 1945. Rations averaged about 1,600 calories per day. Barley gruel, canned beans, sometimes a slice of bread hard as stone. Still, some whispered that they ate better than the soldiers still hiding in the jungles. There was order in the cruelty. Lights out at 9, showers twice a week, cold water only, inspections unannounced. Aiko spent most days in the infirmary, cleaning wounds with carbolic acid and pretending the patients were her old comrades. She tried to forget the war outside the fence, but at night, when the generators hummed, she would hear the guards laughing at their poker table. That sound, the ease of it, cut deeper than any command. In her diary, she later wrote, "They do not shout, that is their power." And it was true. The officers didn't need whips or rifles to break them. Politeness was enough. When orders came, they came softly, like fog creeping over the sea. On one such morning, the air was too still. Even the crows seemed to pause. Then, from across the yard, came the heavy thud of boots. The women straightened instinctively, their bowls clutched to their chests. The commander was coming, clean uniform, calm eyes, boots that gleamed like mirrors waiting to reflect someone else's fall. Dust rose with every step as the commander crossed the yard. The morning light caught his insignia, bright silver bars glinting against the deep olive of his pressed uniform. He wasn't old, maybe 30 at most. His face had the kind of calm that frightened people more than anger ever could. Behind him, 2 guards carried a clipboard and a pair of boots caked in dried mud. The women watched, their eyes low but burning. They had seen commanders before, Japanese and American alike. But this one, Lieutenant Miller, carried something different, precision. He spoke softly, each word chosen like a scalpel. "Good morning, ladies," he began. "Today, we test discipline." Then, with deliberate slowness, he dropped one boot into the dirt. It landed with a heavy thud, splattering dust across the nearest prisoner's skirt. The order was simple, absurd, unforgettable: clean them with your hair. The silence afterward was thick enough to choke on. Aiko's mind blanked. Around her, the women trembled. Their culture revered hair as the extension of spirit, a symbol of femininity, pride, and honor. To use it as a rag was to erase one's self. Reports from Allied archives later confirmed similar, symbolic obedience tests were occasionally used in late-war Pacific camps, officially framed as psychological calibration exercises. In plain terms, humiliation masked as order. Lieutenant Miller's calm made it worse. He didn't smirk. He didn't shout. He just stood there, clipboard in hand, as if taking attendance at a schoolyard. "Proceed," he said again. From somewhere down the line came a muffled sob. One guard shifted awkwardly, as if unsure whether to intervene. Another whispered, "Sir, maybe." But Miller raised a hand, ending the sentence before it began. "Rules are rules," he murmured, barely audible. Aiko's stomach turned. Every lesson of loyalty, every imperial slogan about purity and duty collided in her chest. She wanted to scream, but the air had become too thick to breathe. Her gaze dropped to the boots. The mud looked like dried blood. The reflection of her face in the black leather wavered, ghostly. Then, something inside her, some old instinct snapped. She stepped forward. The sound of her bare feet on gravel echoed like a drumbeat under the watching sun. The shadow of the boot reached her knees as she knelt. Her braid slipped loose. The ground burned beneath her knees. Every breath tasted of dust and iron. Aiko reached out, her fingers shaking as they brushed the commander's boot. The leather was still warm from the sun, the mud flaking under her touch. For a second, she hesitated, her reflection trembling in the black polish like a ghost trapped beneath the surface. Then, slowly, she bent forward and let her hair fall across it. The first stroke was soundless. The second left a faint streak of clean amid the mud. By the third, her scalp began to sting. The coarse grit dragged through each strand, scraping skin. Around her, the world had gone mute. Even the guards forgot to move. The entire camp seemed to hold its breath. 17 witnesses later reported feeling dizzy or sick as they watched. A few women turned away, unable to look, but others stared, frozen between horror and disbelief. One diary entry recovered decades later read, "No lash could hurt like that silence." Aiko's mind splintered into fragments, faces of wounded soldiers, the taste of iodine, the voices that once shouted for the Emperor. All of it blurred into one thought: obedience is survival. She pressed her forehead closer to the boot, using her hair to scrub the sole until it shone faintly in the sun. Lieutenant Miller didn't move. His expression was unreadable, detached. When she finished, he simply said, "Good." No praise, no cruelty. Just that single word. Final, sterile, empty. He turned to leave, his boots clicking in rhythm again, clean now, leaving her crouched in the dust. The moment broke the camp's stillness. Somewhere a woman fainted. Another vomited into her bowl. The guards barked orders to fall back in line. But the women's faces had changed. The humiliation wasn't a wound anymore. It was a fuse. That night, they would whisper in the dark, their shame turning into something sharper. Aiko rose slowly, her knees bleeding where the gravel had bitten into her skin. She looked down at her hair, streaked brown with dirt, and felt something unfamiliar rising in her chest. Not pride, not rage, something quieter, colder, resolve. When the camp lights went out that night, the silence wasn't submission anymore. It was the beginning of defiance. That night, the barracks pulsed with a different kind of silence. Thicker, deliberate, electric. The women lay side by side under coarse blankets, the air hot and still. Somewhere outside, a guard's flashlight beam cut across the wall like a slow-moving blade. Inside, voices began to stir. Not loud enough to draw attention, just enough to ripple the air. Aiko's whisper was the first. "Tomorrow, we don't move." The words barely carried past her lips, but they reached the woman beside her, Sato, the former typist from Osaka, who nodded once. Then another voice, then another. It wasn't a plan written or shouted. It was passed like breath, cell to cell, woman to woman. In that darkness, shame transformed into a quiet weapon. The rules of the camp were carved into their days: rise at 5:30, line up at 6, inspection at 7. Any defiance brought isolation or ration cuts. But that night, Aiko didn't care. Her scalp still burned from the friction of leather. Each time she blinked, she saw her reflection in that boot. Distorted, smaller, erased. Something inside her had flipped, a kind of internal switch from submission to steel. They gathered scraps of cloth and tied them around their wrists, tiny white bands that would mean unity when the time came. A nurse used a stolen candle stub to melt wax and seal the ends. Another woman, once a schoolteacher, recited under her breath a poem about honor that had been banned after surrender. It wasn't rebellion with rifles. It was rebellion with breath. All night the barracks glowed faintly from the ember of that candle. Reports from Allied discipline logs years later noted unusual coordination among female detainees, though no written evidence of what was planned survived. What did survive were the numbers. 1 in 4 female prisoners punished that year for collective insubordination. Just before dawn, the last whisper circled the room, "No one kneels tomorrow." The candle flickered out. The camp sank into stillness again. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It was the stillness of something coiled, waiting. Outside, the sky began to pale. Boots would soon hit the gravel again. The lieutenant would come, clipboard in hand, expecting order. Instead, he'd find a wall of motionless faces, ready to absorb the sun and refuse. The morning came heavy and bright, as if the sun itself wanted to expose everything. Aiko stood in line with the others, wrists wrapped in the small white cloth bands they had tied during the night. The ground was damp from an early rain, the kind that made the air thick and metallic. From the guard tower, a siren wailed once, sharp, distant, then gone. The women didn't flinch. Lieutenant Miller appeared at exactly 7:03, clipboard tucked under his arm, uniform immaculate. The same boots, now spotless, gleamed in the light. Behind him, 2 guards followed, rifles slung loosely over their shoulders. He paused in front of the line, scanning the faces as if searching for something invisible. Then, almost casually, he dropped 1 boot into the mud again. The splash echoed through the yard. "You know the order," he said. No one moved. The seconds stretched, long and impossible. A fly buzzed near Aiko's ear. Somewhere a crow cawed from the barbed wire fence. Still, no one bent. The lieutenant's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He waited, clipboard motionless, pen hovering. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The sun climbed higher, baking the mud, drying the air. According to later records, the standoff lasted 42 minutes. No shouting, no violence, just heat and silence. The guards shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. One whispered, "Sir," but Miller ignored him. He studied the women as though trying to decide whether this was defiance or dignity. Sweat rolled down his temple. Aiko's knees trembled, but she held her ground. Her scalp still ached from yesterday, the ghost of the humiliation pulsing under her skin. Around her, others stood just as still. They weren't soldiers anymore, but in that moment, they carried the weight of an entire broken empire on their shoulders. Finally, another officer appeared, Captain Reynolds, older, broader, with lines of fatigue carved deep into his face. He murmured something to Miller, too quiet to catch. After a few seconds, Miller nodded once. Without a word, he turned away. The order was rescinded. The boots stayed in the mud. As he walked off, something passed between them. A silent acknowledgement, maybe respect, maybe confusion. Aiko didn't know. She only knew this. For the first time, they hadn't obeyed. Behind her, someone began to weep, not from fear, but release. The change didn't happen all at once. It seeped into the camp like slow rain through dry ground. Days passed without another humiliation order. The boots remained in the mud, untouched. a quiet monument to what had happened. And though no one spoke of it aloud, something fundamental had shifted. The guards' footsteps seemed lighter, the officers' eyes lingered less, even the tone of commands softened, as if the air itself had been tamed. Eiko noticed the first sign one morning, when a guard tossed her an extra scoop of barley without a word. It wasn't kindness exactly, more like acknowledgement. Later, she and the other nurses were permitted to boil water for washing, a privilege long denied. They mended uniforms, shared tea brewed from dried weeds, and for the first time in months, someone laughed. It startled them all. The sound cracked through the barracks like thunder, then spread until even Eiko smiled. The camp logs from that period showed something remarkable. Disciplinary notes dropped by nearly 30%. Rumors whispered that headquarters had issued new conduct adjustments for handling female POW. Whatever the reason, the temperature of fear cooled. The women still lined up each dawn, still endured the boredom, the hunger, the flies, but under it all, they carried a strange new strength. Eiko began writing again, using a stub of pencil she'd hidden in her blanket seam. Her entries shifted tone. We are still prisoners, but not broken. She described the way the wind moved through the fence, the distant hum of trucks bringing supplies, the faint smell of gasoline and soap that clung to the guards' clothes. Sense of an industrial machine too vast to fight. Sometimes she even felt sorry for them. One afternoon, Lieutenant Miller passed her in the yard. Their eyes met for a moment. He hesitated, then nodded slightly, a gesture so small most would have missed it. Eiko didn't look away. That was her victory, but peace inside wire is fragile. At night, the same dream returned, her hair tangled in mud, the commander's boots gleaming like mirrors. She woke each time with the taste of dust on her tongue. The war might have been shifting outside the camp, but inside her, it was far from over. The war ended not with an explosion, but with a whisper carried through the camp fences. Japan has surrendered. No trumpets, no shouts, just disbelief. Some women wept openly, others stared at the sky as if expecting it to fall. Eiko stood still, feeling nothing. Freedom, after all that, felt like another order she wasn't ready to follow. Weeks later, Allied trucks rolled in to process the prisoners. The flags changed, the guards were replaced, and a new set of officers arrived with clipboards and questions. Every woman was interrogated, examined, and documented. To the Americans, they were data points in a war they'd already won. To Eiko, it was just another ritual of obedience. The psychologists called it readjustment. They asked the same question in a dozen ways. Why didn't you resist? Eiko's answer never changed, because we were trained not to exist outside command. Her interviewer, a young U.S. psychologist with kind eyes, scribbled that line in his notes. Decades later, researchers would confirm what she had already known. 90% of Japanese POW described loss of self as the deepest wound of captivity, worse than hunger, worse than violence. When repatriation finally came, the women boarded a transport ship heading for Tokyo Bay. The ocean was calm, eerily so. Eiko watched the waves slap against the hull and wondered how to return to a nation that no longer existed in the way she remembered. Her reflection in the water looked older, harder. The nurse who once sewed wounds with fishing line was gone. Years passed, the camp disappeared under vines and concrete, history moved on. Then, one spring afternoon in 1969, Eiko walked into a museum in Kyoto. Inside a glass case stood a pair of scuffed American boots, labeled Camp Commandant's Inspection Footwear, 1945. She froze. The light struck them just as it had that day in the Philippines, harsh, indifferent. For a long time, she said nothing. Visitors moved around her, murmuring, unaware that one of the women from the exhibit was standing beside them. Her reflection overlapped perfectly with the boots behind glass. She almost reached out to touch it, but stopped. The past was close enough already. Still, the memory of those boots would pull her toward one final act of reckoning. The museum smelled faintly of dust and varnish. Outside, Kyoto's spring wind stirred the cherry blossoms, but inside, time stood still. Eiko stood before the glass case, the boots no longer weapons of command, but artifacts of history, mute, preserved, stripped of power. Their black leather had cracked with age, the laces were frayed, the soles worn thin. Yet when the light hit just right, they still glimmered, and she saw her own face reflected in that shine. Around her, tourists whispered softly. A school group passed by, their guide reciting facts in a careful monotone. Captured Japanese personnel, 1945. Allied administered camps. Rehabilitation through order and discipline. The children nodded politely and moved on. None of them looked long enough to feel the weight behind those words. Eiko did, because she had lived inside that order. She remembered the taste of dust, the echo of silence, the way shame could hum louder than gunfire. She remembered the exact sound her hair made against leather, soft, steady, final. It wasn't humiliation that haunted her anymore, it was understanding. She whispered under her breath, "We were not broken, just polished by history's hand." The reflection in the glass seemed to nod back. For a moment, she saw not her own face, but the faces of every woman who had stood beside her. Those who fainted, those who refused, those who didn't survive the voyage home. Only 11 of them had lived long enough to see 1970. The rest had vanished into the long shadow of the war, their stories scattered like ash. But standing there, Eiko realized survival itself was defiance. They hadn't been erased, they'd endured, and in enduring, they had testified. A museum attendant approached quietly, asking if she was all right. Eiko smiled faintly. "Yes," she said. "They're clean now." Her hand brushed the glass not to touch the boots, but to leave the faintest smear, a human mark against the pristine surface of history. Then she turned and walked out into the sunlight. The cherry blossoms drifted down like snow, soft and silent. Each petal carried the weight of memory, light as breath, unbreakable as truth. The war had ended decades ago, but its reflection still followed her, shining, quiet, eternal.